¿Qué pasa, amigos? Bienvenidos al canal y para mis suscriptores, bienvenidos de nuevo. Hoy escuchamos la canción TURiSTA del álbum nuevo del cantante boricua Bad Bunny y hablaremos de lo que podemos aprender.
En mi vida fuiste turista. Tú solo viste lo mejor de mí y no lo que yo sufría. Te fuiste sin saber el porqué de mi herida.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about here is where he says, el porqué de mis heridas. In this case, he's using the word porqué, which is used with no space in between por and que and an accent over the e. And that's the reason for my wounds. Now, you guys probably already know the phrase porqué with a space in between to ask why. So if you want to ask somebody, why did you do that? It would be, ¿por qué hiciste eso? Now, there is also para qué to ask why, and the difference between that I explained in my video on por versus para if you want to go check it out. But in this case, por qué with a space in between is used to ask what somebody's reason is for doing something, why they did it. And you probably already know the word porque with no accent over the e and no space in between, and that means because. So if somebody asks you, ¿por qué hiciste eso? You could say, lo hice porque whatever. And the accent is removed, so the stress falls on that O in por instead of on the second syllable. But there is also a third way to use this, which is with no space and an accent over the E, and that's el porqué. Now that means the reason. El porqué is the reason. And there's two other words which pretty much work exactly the same way in this context. We've got la razón and el motivo. So if you want to ask somebody, what is your reason or what is the reason, you could say, ¿cuál es el porqué? What is the reason? Or ¿cuál es la razón? ¿Cuál es el motivo? It's all asking the same thing. What is the reason? So just keep that in mind when you're spelling these out and when you're pronouncing it, whether there's a space in between those two words or whether there's an accent over that E at the end, because it's going to lead to a completely different word that's used in a different context. Okay, let's move on.
Y no te tocaba a ti curarla, viniste a pasarla bien y la pasamos bien. Una foto bonita, un atardecer hermoso.
Okay, so I want to talk about three things here real quick. So the first thing where he says, viniste a pasarla bien y la pasamos bien. So that phrase, pasarla bien, basically just means to have a good time. And you can use that as an expression with people if you want to say something like, have a good time, like if someone's heading off to a party or whatever, you can say, que la pases bien, which is just using the subjunctive to say, have a good time. In some cases, in certain countries, they will use lo instead of la. So they might say something like, que lo pases bien. But really, it means the same thing. So just keep an eye out for that. But that's how we say that somebody has a good time in Spanish. Pasarla bien, and then it just gets conjugated into whatever tense we're using. Now, the second thing I want to talk about real quick is where he says, una foto bonita. It might seem like foto is one of the Spanish words that doesn't follow the typical spelling rules where if it ends in an A, it's a feminine word versus ending in an O, it's a masculine word. It's una foto bonita. It might seem like it doesn't follow those standard rules, but it's actually a shortened word. It's actually short for fotografía. So fotografía does end in an A, and it follows the normal rules, but it just gets shortened down into foto or la foto. Another example of this is the word for motorcycle, which is motocicleta, but it gets shortened down into moto, la moto. The third thing I want to talk about real quick is where he says atardecer. Now, atardecer is the word meaning sunset. It's a noun, which is el atardecer. It's also used as a verb for the sunset or to get dark. So atardecer could be conjugated as a verb for the sun going down, for getting dark, or it can be used as a noun. And there's lots of examples of this in Spanish where a verb can be used as a noun when it's in its infinitive form, and it's always going to be a masculine noun. So a couple examples of that are like ser, which is to be, the verb meaning to be, but un ser is a being. Another one is poder, which is the word for to be able to, but el poder is power. Another one is el deber, which deber means a few things. It means like to owe. It can be used in certain phrases to talk about what we should or shouldn't do. But when you use it as a noun, el deber means duty. So just keep an eye out for that when you're learning new verbs. A lot of times these verbs, they can be used in their infinitive form as a masculine noun for a word that's related to the verb, like deber being what we should do or what we must do, being our duty, or poder being what we're able to, being our power, or in this case, atardecer, which is the verb meaning to get dark, being used as the noun for sunset. Okay, let's move on.
Una bailadita, tu cadenita de oro. Estuvimos tan cerquita, mirándonos a los ojos. Dime si viste la pena de mi corazón roto, que lleva así mucho tiempo, que lleva así muchos años, escondiéndome los sentimientos. Tengo miedo que me haga más daño, y lleva así mucho tiempo, que lleva así muchos años. Ay.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about here is where he says, lleva así mucho tiempo, lleva así muchos años. So firstly, that word así is used to talk as a comparative to say that something is like something else, or that it's a certain way. So when we say es así, we're basically just saying it's like that. Or a good phrase is así es la vida, which literally would mean life is like that, but it's how we say that's life in Spanish. Now, así is used in a lot of different phrases, which I've talked about before. I'm not going to get into all of those right now, but one of the most common ones that I like to mention a lot is así que, which means so. So if something is a certain way, so something else needs to happen, you use así que. But what I really want to hone in on here is where he says, lleva así mucho tiempo, lleva así muchos años. And that comes from the verb llevar. Now, llevar is used in a lot of different ways in Spanish. It generally means like to carry something or to take something to a certain place or something like that. But it's also used very commonly to talk about how long we've been doing something for. So in this case, he's saying lleva así mucho tiempo. It's been this way for a long time. And you can say something like llevo 4 horas aquí. I've been here for 4 hours. But if you want to follow it up with a verb to say how long you've been doing something for, you're going to always put that verb into the present participle or the gerund from the progressive aspect. So for example, if I ask you, how long have you been learning Spanish for? That's going to give us ¿cuánto tiempo llevas aprendiendo español? So ¿cuánto tiempo? I'm asking how long, how much time. And llevas aprendiendo is how long you've been doing it for, how long you've been learning Spanish for. And again, that's in the gerund form using the progressive aspect. So if you want to tell me I've been learning Spanish for 4 months, you would say, llevo 4 meses aprendiendo español. So that verb llevar is very useful. I'm probably going to have Profe Austin do a deep dive into it at some point. But in this context, it's being used to talk about how long we've been doing something for. So just keep that in mind going forward, okay? Let's move on.
Yo no sé, mi amor, lo que la vida tendrá pa' ti y pa' mí. Si se da, pues se da. Y si no, pues también. Vamos a disfrutar que la noche se puso bonita, pero no tanto como tú. Jamás y nunca como tú.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about here is where he says, pero no tanto como tú, which is saying, but not as much as you. That phrase, tanto como, is a really useful one to talk about something being as much as something else. So the word tanto on its own usually just means so much, and como on its own means like or as. But when you put them together, it becomes this phrase which means as much as, to compare one thing to another thing. So if I say, for example, I don't exercise as much as I would like to, that would be no hago tanto ejercicio como quisiera. So I'm saying I don't do as much exercise as I would like. That tanto como usage is very useful in this context. And I'll just point out real quick that this phrase, tanto como, is only used to say as much as. Now, if we want to say that something is as with a certain adjective as something else, we're not going to say tanto, we're just going to say tan. So for example, if I want to say my house is not as big as hers, that's going to be mi casa no es tan grande como la suya. So I'm saying tan grande como la suya to say as big as hers. So tanto como is only used to say as much as when we're talking about certain quantities or certain amounts that we do like an action or whatever. So just make sure you keep that distinction in mind between those two. But there's another way that we can say tanto como, which is really different here actually, and it's used to say both. So when you want to talk about both of two people doing something or both of two whatever doing something, you use tanto como. Now, in this case, you're going to use tanto in front of the first subject, and como is going to go before the second subject to say both. So if I want to say both my brother and sister made this dinner, that's going to be tanto mi hermano como mi hermana hicieron esta cena. So tanto is going to go in front of the first subject, and then you're going to have como in front of the second subject to say both of those people did something. Okay, let's move on.
En mi vida fuiste turista, tú solo viste lo mejor de mí y no lo que yo sufría. Te fuiste sin saber el porqué de mi herida y no te tocaba a ti curarla.
Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here real quick before we wrap up is where he says, no te tocaba a ti curarla. So he's saying, it wasn't up to you to cure them. So what's interesting here is that verb tocar, which in this case is being conjugated into the imperfect past, is being used to talk about obligation. It wasn't up to you to cure them. So tocar can be used as part of a phrase to say, te toca a ti, me toca a mí, le toca a usted, nos toca a nosotros, or whatever, to talk about it being somebody's turn to do something or somebody being obligated to do something. So something being up to that person to do something. For example, if I'm out to lunch with my friend and they paid for the last lunch, so now it's my turn to pay for this lunch, I would say, me toca a mí pagar el almuerzo. So that verb, pagar, is being left in the infinitive. Just like in the song, he's saying curar in the infinitive. So whatever the verb is that obligation is always going to be left in the infinitive when it's used in this phrase to say te toca a ti, me toca a mí, or whatever. All right, let's go ahead and finish up.
Viniste a pasarla bien y la pasamos bien.
Ok, hermanos y hermanas, pues eso es todo lo que les tengo para hoy. Espero que les haya gustado y que hayan aprendido algo útil hoy. Muchísimas gracias por ver. Nos vemos pronto. Chao.
Mírame mal, si quieres que te cingue, te voy a llevar pa' PR todo el finde. Después de mí, vas a borrar Tinder. Y estoy suelto, mami, estoy suelto. Mírame ahora perreando un experto. Estoy suelto, mami, estoy suelto. Ay, 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 hoy la calle está prendida, juca pastilla molida. Yo